that moment when you're wearing really, really dark lipstick and you're really, really afraid to drink things because inevitable transfer, but you kind of need water to live, but you also really want to look good. Oh. Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. I still feel really weird saying that, it's kind of strange. So, it is October, and October is amazing for multitudes of reasons. It's finally getting colder, the light is changing, you know, that beautiful autumnal, just golden light, despite, you know, the days getting shorter, but we still have that beautiful little bit of light before it leaves. Speaking of leaves, the leaves are going through their annual death throes and death cycles, and therefore making everything look gorgeous, especially in New England. And it is also time for Halloween and spooky shit, which is fantastic. Contrary to popular belief, well, maybe not contrary to popular belief, but I am an enormous weenie. If I was a part of SpongeBob's world, I would be living at Super Weenie Hut Juniors because I get scared so easily, and I get scared by like the most random shit. I'm just ridiculously sensitive and ridiculously empathetic. It's kind of an annoying combination. But weirdly enough, even though I am, you know, like the house mother of Weenie Hut Juniors, I love horror movies. I love scary movies. I don't know why. It's like completely counterintuitive, but I really love scary movies. That being said though, I am kind of a snob when it comes to horror movies because a lot of like what is considered to be horror these days is mostly just like, it's not really stuff that like scares me, which is saying something because like I said, super weenie, I get scared by everything. Like my genre of horror, or what I typically enjoy watching the most, is like psychological stuff, especially from like Japan or South Korea. But like I said, I'm a snob about it. Oh yes, I will only be haunted by the finest spirits of Japan or South Korea, preferably those with lots and lots of anguished wailing. Quickly, to the scariness! But yeah, I've seen a lot of movies that could be considered horror, but are more like action with like dark twists, if that makes sense. But like for me, horror is so much better when it has like really good atmosphere, which is why I like movies from like Asia, because they have like such a good, like rich history with like spirits and ghosts and demons, like especially like in Japan with like yokai and everything like that. Like they just, I feel like people in Asia have like a better grasp of like the supernatural and like what makes something scary. You know, like I said, I have seen a lot of movies that have scared me, but I kind of forget about them like until like a little bit later. I got kind of spooked by the very first Paranormal Activity, and that was kind of my fault because I was watching it alone with headphones in a very old apartment that had a lot of creaking, and I also had a cat at the time, and then there would be times like something really intense would be happening, and all of a sudden I hear her just running down the hallway, and I'd like throw my computer, and I'd be like, stop! Up until this year, I haven't had a movie, for lack of a better word, haunt me quite as much as Ari Aster's debut film, Hereditary. And anybody who has been speaking to me for the past couple of months has known that I have an absolute humongous boner for this movie. Like I said, it's like one of the most like beautifully shot, like well scored, just like imaginative premises, and like something that like really like gets deep into your bones and like haunts you. I am still terrified of this movie. I saw this movie when it came out in theaters back in like June or something, and I still have nights where I wake up and I think that there is something in the corner of my room. It's something. This video, so basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the themes in the movie, some of the parts that I found were the most like terrifying and the most like visceral and like chilling to me. And then I am going to kind of touch on a couple of interviews that I was reading that help like tie in a lot of things, or just like helps like tie a lot of things together. And if you see me looking down a lot in this video, it's because I have my notebook on my lap that has like a bunch of like little prompts, so sorry. It'll give you a chance to look at my makeup. I attempted to do a smoky eye today. It didn't really work, but we'll run with it. I went to go see this movie by myself when it came out because nobody would go with me. So I'm like, fuck it, I'll take myself out on a date. So I went and I watched it. I actually took pictures of myself before and after. And like before you could see like the hope in my eyes. And after I like got home and I'd like my eye face was just like dead. Just like my soul had been sucked out. I literally got so tense and so emotional and so just like shaken up during parts of this movie. I literally had to look up spoilers on my phone while the movie was happening to prepare myself for what would happen, and I still fucking got scared. It's just that creepy and that like unsettling. It's so good. This movie, in a lot of the reviews that I have read, and I agree, and I also agree with this, it is at its core like a family drama with horror elements thrown in. This movie focuses a lot on grief, family structure, like mental health, like what we like inherit from our parents, hence the name Hereditary, like what genetic conditions that you get like from your parents. And yes, it does have some supernatural kind of stuff to it, but that's not where the majority of the horror lies, if that makes sense. Like there's so much more to this movie than just like some weird supernatural presence. So the movie begins with one of the main characters. She's the mother of the family. Her name is Annie, played by the amazing Toni Collette. She has recently lost her mother, and she and her mother had a very weird, very unhealthy, very strange relationship. Annie's family has a very long history of mental illness, but basically, long story short, her family has a slew of mental illnesses, and I'm pretty sure Annie has some of them as well, but it's not really touched upon like that much. So like she's at the funeral and she's like giving this eulogy, and it's just very like, oh, thank you for coming to my mother's funeral and yada yada yada, and it's just very like stiff and very like, it doesn't have a lot of heart to it, and you can obviously tell that the mother and the daughter just weren't close. So Annie's daughter, Charlie, is affected by this the most, because you can see it like in the trailer that the mother like tells Charlie, it's like, you know, you were her favorite, right? And there's also a brother named Peter, and then there's the father, I kind of forget his name, but he's just so like he doesn't have as much of a presence as the rest of them do. Not to say that his part wasn't acted very well, because it was. It's just like him as a character, he just kind of fades into the woodwork a little bit. So the movie has a pretty slow build up until about, I want to say like 45 minutes in, maybe a little less. It is established early on in the movie that Charlie has a peanut allergy. She and Peter are at a party, and she eats a piece of cake that contains walnuts. And this is where it gets sort of into spoiler territory, so please be advised. Like I said, I'll link the timestamps down below. But like I said, this is spoiler territory, proceed at your own risk. So basically what happens is Charlie eats this piece of cake with walnuts in it. She goes into anaphylactic shock, and Peter has to rush her to the hospital. She's like gasping for air and everything, and he's going really fast down the road. And so Charlie opens up the window to stick her head out to try and get air. Peter sees something in the middle of the road, swerves, and in the twist I was not fucking expecting, Charlie just becomes decapitated on a telephone pole. Like, she sticks her head out and her head just is just clean off of her body. And I literally remember sitting in the theater just like, the fuck just happened? And you can see that in the actor who plays Peter. You can see it in his eyes. He's like looking in the rear view. He's just like, I think at one point he actually goes like, are you okay? And it like, just thinking about it still gives me goosebumps. Like, I'm wearing a sweater, but like, holy fuck. Like that scene, and like he's just sort of sitting there, like just taking all of this in. He you know, drives home. Annie finds out the next morning, and you hear her let out like one of the most like anguished, just like sorrowful, just like horrifying, just cries. It's like this parent just lost their child, and it's like, whew, like I said, I think Toni Collette actually got into the Oscar race for the role in Hereditary, and it's like really fucking well deserved, because she is like on top of her game, like without a shadow of a doubt. This event of Charlie dying kind of begins this whole cycle of like mental deterioration on the family's part. There's Peter, who's like suffering with the guilt of having done this to his sister. There's the mother, who is obviously grieving not only her mom, who's like kind of like but she's like going to like grief like recovery groups and whatever, but then now she has to deal with the loss of her child, who obviously is hitting her way harder, and she's just spiraling, and she just doesn't know what to do. She makes a friend named Joan in her grief recovery group, and she, you know, starts talking to Joan about things, about like how the family is like kind of fucked up, and she mentions at one point how Annie used to sleepwalk, and there was one time when she remembers waking up out of like this sleepwalk like reverie. She was covered in paint thinner, and her kids were covered in paint thinner because they were sharing a room at the time, and she was standing there with a match like lit in her hand, and she's like, and I'm like, whew, all right, that's kind of fucked up. I mean, my family's kind of nuts, but Jesus, that's like a whole different level of fucked up. So she's like relaying like a bunch of like all this like weird past family trauma shit to Joan, and then Joan is like, look, I know this sounds crazy, but have you considered a seance to talk to Charlie? And Annie's like, the fuck are you talking about? Like, no, like I would never consider that. But like, you know, Joan like talks her into it. And when Annie sees that it actually works, because Joan was able to call upon like her son or like her grandkid or something like that, when she sees how well that worked, she's like, okay, I'm gonna try and call upon Charlie. And so she takes a spell book back to her house and recites these words and kind of invites, just opens the door for like the supernatural shit. And this is where the supernatural shit comes in. And basically that's like the catalyst to like kick off even more craziness, like even more mental deterioration. Oh, I really like it because the supernatural presence isn't like blah, demon, spooky, blah, shifting in and just like taking control of you and just like nah. Like they take control of you, but it's like in a more like subtle way, where it's like it's gonna kind of creep into your head and kind of take possession of you and kind of like back off. And the way it's represented in the movie is just like a glimmer of light, just like a little shimmer. Like kind of like if you have like a crystal or something like hanging in your window, like that prismatic kind of shift. It's just represented by that. It's something that you see a lot, and it's something that you wouldn't really think of as being like demonic, because when you think demonic, you think dark and shadows and spooky. And the whole movie is very starkly shot, like very beautifully shot, and I'll get into that in a minute, but it's very shadowy and dark and brooding. But then you see like this demonic presence, which is a light, which I think is really cool, like a really awesome kind of like juxtaposition in a way. The spirit that was like introduced into the world with the mom starting the seance, she wasn't actually channeling Charlie, she actually was bringing in this demon called Paimon, some sort of like devil god, like demon of like mischief and whatever, and it was looking for like a host body. And so Paimon comes into Annie's body, and it's looking for like a male host, and basically Annie just goes further and further down like the drain. She just like circles the drain, and the last 20 minutes, excluding the very, very end, but I'm gonna get to that. So the last 20 minutes of this movie, my heart was racing so fast, like I couldn't breathe. And there's like, it's just so well shot and just so well timed, and it's just perfect. I will say though, this is my one critique I have of this movie. The ending, like the very, very ending bit, involves the demon Paimon coming into Peter's body, and then he goes up into like this tree house, like where his sister used to like spend a lot of her time. And there's like, and Joan is like this cult leader because his grandmother, because you know, the grandmother of this family was like this cult priestess, and Joan was one of the followers, and she's basically like trying to bring forth Paimon into like the human realm so he can go and unleash chaos on everything and like fulfill like this role, blah blah blah. That, like the whole thing, like, you know, Peter's like standing there and people are like bowing before him and stuff, and I'm just like, I get what you're trying to do, Ari Aster, I really do, but I feel like that whole bit at the end kind of cheapened the movie a little bit. I feel like it could have ended with, because like the movie ends basically like, you know, Peter like is in this attic and he sees his mom like decapitate herself with wire. I didn't watch this part. I literally had to cover my eyes, because like I said, huge weenie. I had to literally cover my eyes, and I'm just like, I can't watch this. And he is so freaked out. He sees like some cult followers in the attic, and he jumps out a window and just falls and presumably dies. And then you see the demon, like the light come into him, and then he sits up and he makes like this, like the trademark kind of like tongue click noise that his sister did. And I feel like it could have ended there and it would have been great, but like that demon meeting at the end of it kind of cheapened it a little bit. But I feel like it was a kind of a good, almost like palate cleanser, because I was just so freaked at that point. I'm just like, okay. But anyway, so that is the plot in a nutshell. Kind of nutshell. This is the end of spoiler territory right here. So welcome back for those of you who were not trying to spoil things for themselves. I didn't really do a good job at explaining the plot, but whatever. Some of the best parts of this movie aren't even like jump scares. There are very, very few jump scares. There's very mild gore. There are a few shots that are very jarring and very out of the blue almost. And I feel like the impact this movie has is just like the relationship within the family and the way that they're processing grief and how they just sort of interact with each other. Not to mention the way that the movie is shot. Like the cinematography is done by a Polish cinematographer. His name is Paweł Pogorzelski. And the way that this movie is shot is very, very important because it is very starkly, like, it's very high contrast. There's lots of shadows. There's lots of beautiful, like, cool tones. Just like lots of blues, lots of grays, lots of browns, kind of like muted colors. And there are some instances in this movie where you see things like standing in the corners of the rooms. And this isn't necessarily spoiler territory per se. Like there's like this one shot like within like the first like 10 minutes where Annie is going through some of her mom's old scrapbooks or something in an attic. And she looks over and she sees like this partially kind of like this sort of ghostly image of her mom. Like she doesn't have a head, like you can't see her face. All you see is like her shoulders and her arms and her hands. And she's wearing like this black dress and she's just sort of standing there. And I'm literally getting goosebumps thinking about this. Like the whole thing of like seeing things like in shadows, or like, you know, like when you turn off a light and your eyes like take a while to adjust to it. Like this movie does a lot of that, or like a lot of like mind trickery. There's like a part like at the end where like Peter is sitting in bed and he's like sitting up and it's very dark and you're wondering, why am I focusing just on Peter? And then all of a sudden your eyes adjust and you look up in a corner and you're like, oh my fuck, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. And if you don't see it, there's like a bit where, you know, the camera kind of changes and Peter's like looking around and then you see the thing that was in the corner just kind of scuttle along the wall and it's just like, ugh. It's so scary. It's so fucking terrifying. Like, that just adds to it. Like, Alright, so at this point, I'm gonna kind of delve into like some of the reviews that I read online about this movie, just to kind of get a little bit of like where like the cinematographer is coming from and kind of like what a couple other, what someone else like thinks of like the premise behind it. Because generally, like I said, almost every single person who watched this is like, oh, this is like a family thing with a bit of horror thrown into it, which I agree wholeheartedly. And I will also explain why, another reason why this movie is so terrifying to me like after this. But there was a review written by Anne Hornaday in the Washington Post on June 7th, and I'm going to be looking down and kind of reading, so please forgive me. It mentions that this is the kind of movie that draws immediate comparisons to the everyday surrealism and psychological dread of Roman Polanski and David Lynch while forging its own weird aesthetic path. And I agree with this wholeheartedly. I definitely could see a lot of David Lynch-esque vibes, especially in the dialogue and in the pacing of some of like the more like tense scenes. And I could definitely see a lot of influences with Roman Polanski, specifically Rosemary's Baby, in this, and also with like the way that some of the shots were set up. And I haven't seen as much of Polanski as I've seen David Lynch. I have been an enormous fan of David Lynch ever since I was like 17 and I saw Eraserhead and I'm just like, oh, done, favorite director. But that's beside the point. But yeah, I feel like that's a really good comparison to draw, like with David Lynch and Roman Polanski, because I can definitely see the similarities between the two of them. So there is another interview with the cinematographer Pavel, oh my god, I'm so sorry, Pavel Pogorzelski. And yeah, the cinematography, I agree, is definitely like in a league of its own. Like, it's just so good. And the score, I forget who scored it. I should have written it down, but the score is like, it adds like so much to it. So this was an interview with Jonathan James in The Daily Dead, also on June 7th. And Pogorzelski explains that he didn't watch horror movies growing up in his traditional Polish household. But when he went to film school, he took a horror class and he said it opened up his mind. He said, quote, "It just opened up my mind to how amazing horror films are and exploring the world that we live in today. They are really looking deep down into what are our fears and playing on that." And I respect that. Like, I respect that a lot, because this is not a typical like shock film, like a shock and like gore film. Like, this really delves down deep and like kind of picks at some things that kind of like will fuck you up. I find that kind of horror like so much more interesting. He also says, "I thought that was so fascinating. That there was so much to be said and so much more interesting things to be explored in horror, that from there on," when, you know, he was in film school, "that from there on I really started enjoying horror movies and looking for the complexities. It wasn't just about the gore, but there was more cinematic emblems inside to look for." And I think that's really fucking cool. Now, there are, like I said a couple of times, there are gory moments in Hereditary, but that's not what makes it scary. And like, I understand that like slasher flicks are considered to be horror, but they're more like campy. And like, that's fine. Like, it's okay if that's like, if you think of that as horror. I feel like everybody has like their own definition of what horror is. Like, it's all like really, really relative. But I don't consider slasher flicks to be horror. I don't really even consider things like Saw to be horror. I consider stuff like Requiem for a Dream to be horror. I consider like Black Swan to be horror. I consider like, I guess like The Witch was sort of horror in general. I don't even know what The Witch could be. I feel like The Witch is more like drama, but that's the kind of stuff that I like, especially because The Witch had religious undertones to it and like corrupting a very Puritan like religious household, which I am like obsessed with. I love that, but that's a topic for another video. Not gonna let myself get too distracted. So for me, horror can be best described as that feeling you get when, if you're like in a multi-level house and you're turning off all the lights to go upstairs for the night, and you turn off that last light and you sprint up the stairs into a well-lit room because you're afraid of something down there that's gonna like chase after you. I think one of the main reasons that this film was so scary to me is because it really touches on like a family that's like disintegrating, and a family that is grieving, and like people who are grieving. And I personally am not that good with grieving. I understand I need to give myself space to feel and to like give myself space to mourn, but I always feel like I'm taking too long to do it. And when I see other people grieve, I like feel so deeply for them. And I experienced a loss about a year ago, and it was someone who was very close to me, and I still miss them very much, and I still, you know, get kind of emotional like when I think about them. Just like seeing grief displayed like so like raw, like so like in such a raw way, and just so like, and people just being like so into their roles and just putting so much into it. It's just like almost like intrusive in a way. I feel like I'm spying on somebody because it's just so emotional. And like, I get along really well with my family, and I always get kind of like the empathy switch in me gets cranked up to like 20 when I see like families that are like falling apart, especially when there's like an outside force involved. And that was one of the things that like got to me. Not to mention, part of it might have been like, hey, is this like demon thing like even real, or is this just like something that you inherited, like a hereditary thing from your parents that, you know, like, is this like is this all real, or is this fake? Is this family being driven to madness by some supernatural outside force, or is it just the trauma of like, you know, losing somebody and grieving and having, you know, you kind of like detach from reality for a little bit. I am not a therapist. I am not a mental health professional in any way, shape, or form. Mental illness is still something, like, even to this day, even though we're like more aware of it and we're like becoming more aware of like the symptoms and things like that, especially for things like depression, anxiety, like eating disorders, etc., like we're more aware of them, but it's like the ocean. Like there's still so much to be explored and so much that we still don't know yet. And the whole like idea of being trapped like inside your head and not being able to escape it, or not understanding what's going on, or not allowing yourself to feel these feelings, especially when you're grieving, knowing that your brain can work against you in such powerful ways is really terrifying. And that, I think, is what makes a really good horror movie. Something that gets in your head and just sticks with you. And you're like, I still think about Hereditary to this day. Like, I saw it back in June. Like I said, I saw it back in June in theaters, and I still think about it. It's one of those movies that I know I need to watch again to like pick up on some things, but I'm still too much of a weenie to do it. All right, that was a very long and rambly video. Yeah, so if you haven't seen Hereditary and you want something scary to watch, yeah, go watch it. It's so good. It's like, it's not for the faint of heart. I had a friend who shall remain nameless who said, oh yeah, I saw Hereditary, it wasn't that scary. I totally thought, you know, A Quiet Place was so much scarier. And he fucking knows who he is, and he knows I love him very much. But dude, I watched A Quiet Place and that shit was awful. Like, it was so stupid. Like, the premise of it was great. Like, I liked the idea of it and everything, but the way it was executed was not that good, and it definitely was not as scary as this movie, so you know I still love you, and I do respect your opinions on other movies, just not that. Alright everyone, I am alone in my apartment, and I have successfully freaked myself out a little bit, so I am going to go put on something bright and shiny, and I am going to light some candles, and maybe order some takeout, and just kind of have a little moment of zen. So like I say at the end of all my videos, I love and appreciate every single one of you who takes time to watch my videos, even though they are very rambly and silly. And I will see all of you in the next one. Love you. Bye!